The mainframe console flashed red as the database connections began to drop. The CEO grabbed Christian's collar. "What do you mean we lost the master keys?" Before Christian could speak, the terminal screen turned completely black. 18 years. That is how long I spent keeping the lights on at Summit Credit Union. My name is Douglas Sterling, and at 54 years old, I know that in the tech world, 18 years is several geological eras. Languages rise and fall, frameworks disappear, but the underlying plumbing of the financial world remains stubbornly old. While the marketing department spent millions on sleek mobile apps and trendy user interfaces, the entire weight of our $1.2 billion in assets rested on a quiet, freezing cold room in the basement of our Charlotte headquarters. That was my domain, the IBM mainframe running ZOS, every single credit card swipe, every direct deposit, every mortgage payment routing through the automated clearinghouse network eventually had to talk to my code. Most of it was legacy COBOL, written back when monitors only showed green text on black screens. It was messy, it was complex, and it was beautiful in its efficiency. I knew every patch, every memory address shift, and every single quirk of the interface. If the mainframe sneezed, the credit union went blind. The board members did not understand this, of course. To them, the servers in the basement were just a line item on a spreadsheet, an expensive necessity they wished they could shrink. My daily routine was simple. I arrived at 6 in the morning, before the trading markets opened in New York. I would sit down at my desk, pour a cup of hot jasmine tea, and log into the terminal. I checked the transaction queues, verified the cryptographic keys on our hardware security modules, and ran the daily maintenance scripts. I spent my days patching bugs that only appeared when millions of database rows were processed simultaneously and optimizing execution loops to save milliseconds. It was quiet, steady work. I expected to finish my career here, retire with my stock options, and spend my days tending to my backyard garden. But then, the credit union appointed Christian Thorne as our new vice president of technology infrastructure. Christian was 31, wore tailored suits without ties, and spoke exclusively in buzzwords he picked up during his 2-year stint at a consulting firm. His father, Donald Thorne, sat on our board of directors, which explained how a kid with a fresh MBA and zero experience running a live production environment ended up in charge of our entire operations. Christian did not look at the mainframe as a critical engine of a financial institution. He looked at it as a legacy liability. He wanted to migrate everything to the public cloud, outsource the maintenance, and claim a massive performance bonus for cutting the operating budget. On his second week, Christian walked into my office. He did not look at the terminal screen or the technical manuals stacked on my shelf. He looked at me, a 54-year-old man in a faded polo shirt, and saw an obstacle. He brought along Arjun Patel, a representative from ZetaSync Technologies. ZetaSync was a managed service provider that specialized in offshore IT operations. Christian explained to me that the future of Summit Credit Union was agile, lean, and global. He wanted to transition the mainframe support to ZetaSync's offshore team within 3 months. I tried to explain the reality of the situation. I pointed to the architecture diagram on the wall. I explained that Summit Core did not run like a modern web application. It relied on deeply integrated hardware security modules, specifically the IBM Crypto Express card, to handle the high-speed cryptographic operations required for routing transactions. The integration was not standard. It required a custom middleware wrapper I had written years ago to translate the transaction packets before they hit the hardware keys. Without that wrapper, the system could not talk to the federal routing networks. Christian just smiled, that polished, condescending smile they teach you in business school. He told me that Arjun's team had hundreds of certified cloud engineers and that they would have no problem handling a legacy system. He asked me to begin document dump processes, exporting all my personal build scripts and operational procedures to a shared folder. I could see the writing on the wall. They did not want my expertise. They wanted to strip my brain of 18 years of knowledge, hand it to a cheap offshore team, and show me the door. What Christian did not know was that the custom middleware wrapper, a software module I called Cipher Shield 9, was not property of Summit Credit Union. I had written it before I even joined the company, under my own private entity, Sterling Tech Solutions, LLC. When I was hired in 2008, the credit union was in a rush to implement ACH routing. Their legal team, desperate to close the deal, signed an employment contract with a specific IP writer. Under Rider C, the credit union was granted a license to use Cipher Shield 9 for a nominal fee of $1 a year. But the contract was clear. If my employment was terminated without cause, the license would enter a 30-day grace period, after which it would expire automatically. I never mentioned Rider C to Christian. I wanted to see if his expensive education had taught him how to read a contract before making a move. The meeting invitation appeared on my calendar at 4:30 on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The subject line was blank. It was sent by Christian's executive assistant, and the location was the executive conference room on the top floor, far away from my basement server racks. I took a slow sip of my tea, closed my active terminal sessions, and walked to the elevator. I knew exactly what was coming. When I entered the room, Christian was sitting at the glass table, tapping his fingers on a sleek tablet. Next to him was a representative from Human Resources named Brenda, who looked like she would rather be anywhere else in the world. Arjun Patel from ZetaSync was on the speakerphone, his voice crackling through the digital line. Christian didn't ask me to sit. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a 3-page document titled Technical Transfer and Systems Decoupling Authorization. It was a formal sign-off stating that the entire Summit Core database schema and the cryptographic routing pipelines were ready to be migrated to ZetaSync's offshore center in Bangalore. I looked at the document, then looked up at Christian. I told him that I had already run the compliance checks on their migration plan. The offshore team was planning to use a standard software emulator to mimic the IBM Crypto Express hardware in their testing environment. I explained that it was a massive security vulnerability. Emulators do not have physical tamper detection or hardware-level key isolation. If they pushed that configuration to production, we would fail our annual payment card industry compliance audit within minutes. I told him I could not sign the authorization. Christian's face tightened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He told me that my job was not to audit his decisions, but to execute them. He said that my stubbornness was holding the company back from a digital transformation and that he was tired of my constant roadblocks. He told me that my refusal to sign the transfer document constituted a direct refusal to perform my duties. Brenda, the HR representative, cleared her throat and opened a second folder. She pulled out a termination notice. Christian told me that I was being terminated immediately for gross insubordination. Because the termination was for cause, the credit union was exercising its right under Section 14 of our equity incentive plan to forfeit all my unvested restricted stock units. 4,000 shares, valued at $30 each, $120,000 of my retirement savings, gone with a single stroke of his pen. They expected me to argue. They expected me to yell, to make threats, or perhaps to beg for my job. Christian had a smug look on his face, waiting for the satisfaction of seeing the old mainframe guy break down. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my pen, and signed the termination acknowledgement. I did not mention Rider C. I did not mention that the software they were about to run their entire business on was licensed under my private LLC. I simply slid the signed document back to Brenda. Christian looked slightly disappointed by my lack of reaction. He told me that I had 30 minutes to pack my personal belongings and that I would be escorted from the building by security. He demanded that I hand over all administrative credentials and physical access keys. I took my physical YubiKey admin token off my keychain and placed it on the glass table. I wrote down the master root passwords for the Z/OS partition on a sheet of scrap paper. I gave them exactly what they asked for: the administrator access, the root credentials, and the passwords. 10 minutes later, a security guard stood outside my cubicle in the basement while I packed my things. I didn't have much. A ceramic tea mug, a jar of loose jasmine tea leaves, a framed photo of my wife, and 3 black hardcover notebooks filled with 20 years of handwritten COBOL, memory address offsets, register mappings, and system architecture diagrams. The guard looked inside the box, checked the notebooks to make sure I wasn't stealing company documents, and escorted me to the service elevator. As the elevator doors closed, I looked at the basement corridor. It was quiet, the steady hum of the server fans vibrating through the concrete floor. For 18 years, I had protected that system from crashes, power outages, and external attacks. Now it was Christian's responsibility. I walked out into the pouring Charlotte rain, placed my box of belongings in the trunk of my car, and drove home. The first thing I did when I walked through my front door was call Clara DuPont, my attorney. Clara had been a friend for years, and she specialized in technology contracts and intellectual property law. I told her that Christian had fired me for cause and canceled my RSUs. I could hear the rustle of papers on her end of the line as she pulled up my original 2008 employment agreement from her digital archives. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but I could hear the sharp edge of a seasoned lawyer who smelled blood in the water. She told me to stay home, tend to my garden, and let the clock run down. For the first 2 weeks after my firing, I did not think about computers at all. I spent my mornings in the backyard, pruning my tomato plants and clearing out the weeds under the oak trees. I drank my jasmine tea while the sun rose, enjoying the quiet that I hadn't felt in nearly 2 decades. My phone remained silent. I had blocked Christian's number, and Clara was handling all official communications. On the 15th day, Clara sent the official letter. It was addressed to the General Counsel of Summit Credit Union, with a copy sent directly to Christian's office. It was a formal notice of license expiration and impending intellectual property infringement. The letter was dry, precise, and devastating. Clara attached a copy of Rider C from my 2008 employment contract. She pointed out that the proprietary middleware module, C.F.R. Shield 9, was registered under United States copyright law to Sterling Tech Solutions LLC. The credit union had been operating the software under a revocable license that cost $1 a year. Because I had been unilaterally terminated, the contract dictated that the license key would enter a 30-day grace period. On midnight of the 30th day, the license would expire, and any continued operation of the software would constitute willful infringement of federal copyright law. I later found out through an old colleague in the compliance department that the letter caused a brief stir in the legal office. The general counsel had immediately called Christian in for a meeting, but Christian, in his infinite arrogance, dismissed the warning. He told the legal team that I was just a bitter ex-employee trying to shake them down for a severance package. He claimed that the code running on their machines belonged to them because it was written during my employment, completely ignoring the fact that the copyright had been registered before I ever signed my tax forms with them. He told the general counsel that ZetaSync could easily write a replacement script or bypass the check. Out in Bangalore, Arjun Patel and his team were suddenly handed a high-priority task. They were told to locate the source code for C.F.R. Shield 9 on the mainframe and rewrite it to remove the license verification checks. But Arjun's team ran into a wall of technical reality. Mainframes do not operate like modern web servers where you can just open a text file and edit the code. The C.F.R. Shield 9 module was running as a compiled load module, a highly optimized, pre-linked binary file that was loaded directly into the ZOS authorized program facility. The source code was not on the mainframe. It was sitting on an encrypted offline drive in my study at home. Without the source code, trying to modify the binary load module was like trying to rewrite a book by looking at the ink patterns on a shredded page. They tried to decompile it, but the compilation flags I had used in my build pipeline stripped all debugging symbols and restructured the binary execution paths to prevent reverse engineering. The moment they tried to run a basic disassembler, they were met with a wall of raw, unreadable machine instructions. Next, Arjun tried to write a bypass script. He attempted to reroute the transaction data queue directly to the IBM Crypto Express card, trying to cut my middleware out of the loop entirely. But my middleware did not just verify the license, it performed a critical data translation. The mainframe database stored client accounts in EBCDIC format, an old character encoding system used by IBM. The federal routing networks and modern payment processors used ASCII. C.F.R. Shield 9 translated the EBCDISS data stream into ASCII, padded the data structure to meet strict security standards, and calculated the cryptographic check value before sending it to the hardware security module. When Arjun tried to bypass my module in their staging environment, the hardware security module rejected the transaction packets. The mainframe threw a series of critical system errors, stating that the input block size was invalid. The system could not understand the raw, untranslated data. While ZetaSync was desperately searching for a workaround, the clock was ticking. Clara's letter had specified the exact second the grace period would end. I did not have to write a single line of malicious code. I did not have to install a Trojan horse, a time bomb, or run a remote command. The software was simply doing what it was designed to do, verify that its license was valid before running its daily cryptographic routine. It was a standard digital rights management feature, common in almost every commercial software package in the world. On day 29, Clara called me. She told me that Summit's legal department had sent a brief response, claiming they owned all work product created during my tenure, and warning us that any disruption to their systems would result in criminal charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Clara had laughed when she read me the email. She told me she had replied with a single sentence, reminding them that failing to renew a contract and continuing to use unlicensed proprietary software was a civil copyright issue, not a cybercrime. She closed her email by saying we looked forward to resolving the matter in federal court if they chose to keep running the unlicensed software past the deadline. That night, I went to bed early. I knew that at midnight, the calendar would roll over to day 31. The breakdown began at exactly 12 midnight. At that second, the system initiated the scheduled daily maintenance cycle. The Cipher Shield 9 module launched its startup sequence, queried the local license database, and checked the digital signature of the license file. The certificate was expired. Following its internal security protocol, the module logged a license failure to the system console, refused to initialize the translation buffers, and shut down. Within minutes, the first transaction failed. A customer at a gas station in South Charlotte tried to swipe their debit card, and the merchant terminal received a timeout error. By 1 in the morning, the batch processing queue for all regional automated clearinghouse transactions, representing millions of dollars in payroll deposits, mortgage payments, and commercial transfers, ground to a halt. The transactions were piling up in the system memory, unable to be translated, encrypted, or routed. By 6 in the morning, when I was pouring my first cup of tea, the online banking app was flooded with thousands of login attempts. The system could not authenticate users because the security tokens could not be verified by the mainframe. The credit union's customer service call center was completely overwhelmed, and the queue wait time jumped to 3 hours. In the Charlotte headquarters, the atmosphere was pure chaos. Christian Thorne had been woken up by an automated emergency page at 2 in the morning. He had rushed to the office, still wearing his suit jacket over a wrinkled shirt. He spent the night pacing the floor of the glass conference room, screaming at Arjun Patel and his offshore team over the speakerphone. Arjun's team tried their last desperate measure. They attempted to force the mainframe to load an older version of the system library, trying to bypass the cryptographic verification check by injecting unencrypted transaction blocks directly into the IBM Z15 database. It was a fatal mistake. The IBM Z15 mainframe is designed with some of the most advanced hardware-level security in the world. When the system detected an unauthenticated administrative account trying to inject data blocks directly into the cryptographic registers, bypassing the official encryption pipeline, it assumed a major cyber attack was underway. The physical mainframe console flashed red. The hardware security module activated its anti-tamper protocol. It cleared its volatile memory, locked the master cryptographic registers, and shut down the entire partition. To make matters worse, the automated security protocol immediately sent a secure, encrypted alert to the National Credit Union Administration. By law, any potential systemic breach of a federally insured financial institution must be reported within 1 hour. At 7:30 in the morning, my cell phone began to ring. The caller ID showed Christian Thorne's personal number. I let it ring. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. Then he called again and again. On the 4th call, I picked up before I could even say hello. Christian was screaming. His voice was cracked and shaking with rage. He called me a criminal. He accused me of hacking the mainframe, of sabotage, and of stealing company data. He told me that he had already contacted the credit union's legal team, that they were filing emergency injunctions, and that he was going to make sure the FBI locked me in a federal penitentiary for the rest of my life. I waited until he ran himself out of breath. I took a slow sip of my tea, listening to the static on the line. I told him that I hadn't touched a keyboard since the day he escorted me out of the building. I reminded him that I had handed over all my passwords, administrative access codes, and physical tokens. I told him to look at the mainframe system logs. They would show that the system shut down because of an expired license key, a civil contractual dispute, not an unauthorized intrusion. I told him that if he had read Rider C, he would have known this day was coming, and I added that his attempt to force unencrypted data into the HSM was what triggered the federal security lockout, not me. Christian began to stutter, trying to find his words. He demanded that I come to the office immediately to fix the system. He said the credit union was losing thousands of dollars every minute, and that my career was over if I didn't cooperate. I told him that I was no longer an employee of Summit Credit Union, and that I had no legal right to access their systems. I suggested he speak to my lawyer, Clara Dupont, and then I hung up. An hour later, Clara called me. She was in high spirits. She told me that Summit's general counsel had just called her, his voice trembling. He had bypassed Christian entirely. Two federal regulators from the NCUA had just arrived at the Charlotte headquarters, demanding to know why the credit union's transaction routing was offline and why a security lockout had been triggered. Clara told me that the credit union's legal team had begged for an emergency settlement. They wanted to know what it would take to get the license key renewed and the system back online today. I told Clara my terms, and she wrote them down. We were no longer just asking for my unvested RSUs. The price had just gone up. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Clara and I walked into the executive conference room of Summit Credit Union. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The CEO, the general counsel, and several members of the board of directors were present. Donald Thorne, Christian's father, was sitting at the end of the table, his arms crossed, looking dark-faced. Christian himself was conspicuously absent. The CEO did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, and his eyes bloodshot. He told us that they were facing a regulatory shutdown from the NCUA if the transaction system was not restored by the end of the business day. He admitted that their attempts to bypass the security module had failed. He asked Clara for our terms. Donald Thorne tried to intervene. He stood up, slamming his hands on the table, and claimed that the credit union should not negotiate with a contractor who held their systems hostage. He threatened to tie us up in litigation for years. Clara did not blink. She reached into her briefcase and laid out a stack of documents. She showed them the copy of the copyright certificate for C.F.R. Shield 9, registered in 2007, a full year before I joined the credit union. She then showed them the 2008 employment contract with the signed writer C. She explained that there was no hostage situation. The credit union had simply allowed a software license to expire, and continuing to use it was a federal copyright violation. She pointed out that any litigation would be public, and the news that Summit was running its core systems on unlicensed, insecure software would destroy whatever public trust the institution had left. The general counsel looked at Donald Thorne and told him to sit down and be quiet. The lawyer knew they had no case. The NCUA was already in the building, and every hour of downtime was costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost transaction fees and potential regulatory penalties. Clara then read our final demand package. First, the credit union would pay out the full value of my unvested restricted stock units, $120,000, plus an additional $100,000 in back pay and severance. Second, Summit Credit Union would execute a new 3-year commercial licensing agreement for C.F.R. Shield 9 with Sterling Tech Solutions LLC. The licensing fee would be $150,000 annually, with all 3 years paid up front. That was $450,000, wired to my company account immediately. Third, Christian Thorne would be terminated immediately for gross negligence and system endangerment, and the credit union would cancel its outsourcing agreement with ZetaSync Technologies. The CEO looked at the general counsel. The general counsel gave a slow, defeated nod. There was no alternative. The CEO signed the settlement agreement and the new software license and instructed the finance director to initiate the wire transfers. I sat quietly, checking the bank application on my phone. Within 10 minutes, the transfers cleared. The funds were in my accounts. I opened my laptop, connected to my secure personal server, and generated a new, digitally signed 3-year license key for C.F.R. Shield 9. I handed the USB drive containing the key to the credit union's lead infrastructure administrator, who was waiting at the door. We walked down to the basement mainframe room to monitor the progress. The administrator loaded the new license key into the Z-OS configuration directory and restarted the C.F.R. Shield 9 daemon. On the console, the red warning lights went out. The system logs showed a clean initialization sequence. The module validated the digital signature, established the secure data translation buffers, and initiated the connection to the cryptographic card. Within seconds, the transaction queues began to clear. Millions of dollars in pending ACH transfers and direct deposits started routing to their destinations. The ATM network came back online, and the customer portal began accepting logins again. As we walked out of the building, we saw Christian Thorne being escorted to the elevator by 2 security guards, carrying his belongings in a cardboard box. He looked at me, his face pale and his mouth open, but he did not say a word. I simply gave him a polite nod. I retired that afternoon. I invested the $670,000 into a conservative portfolio, adding to my existing savings. Today, I spend my time in my garden, watching the flowers grow. Summit Credit Union eventually hired a competent technology firm to manage their systems, and they pay my company $150,000 every year just to keep the license active. I spend about 5 hours a week checking their system logs from my home office, tea in hand, making sure the lights stay on.